Good day, friends. It's a pleasure to welcome you all on our very first CNED Development Dialogue. This is a new edition that we are beginning from the Observer Research Foundation and the Center for New Economic Diplomacy. And our guest for the conversation is none other than Dr. K.Y. Amoako, who I really think is one of those wise men on the African continent who has headed the UN Economic Commission for Africa, who has been the World Bank's representative in different countries across the continent, and who currently runs the think tank African Center for Economic Development. But more important, he's just written this fabulous book called Know the Beginning Well, which traces Africa's development journey. So who better than Dr. Amoako for us to begin the CNED Development Dialogues? Dr. Amoako, you are in Washington, D.C. today, I understand.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
Right. So let me just say that, with all of the development experience that you've gathered over the decades, never anticipated something on the scale of the COVID pandemic, which has turned the world upside down. And in fact, there's a feeling that it's also been a setback to the economic progress that several countries in Africa, including Ghana, from where you're based, had registered. How do you see Africa dealing with COVID-19 and its aftermath, and any of the new development challenges that come up in its wake?
Well, thanks very much, Ambassador Suri. It's my pleasure to meet you and your friends and followers on camera today. Well, like you said, I wrote this book, Know the Beginning Well, because as you said, I've been involved in African development for over close to a century. I spent almost 20 years at the World Bank. I headed the Economic Commission for Africa. I now have a think tank working on African economic transformation as a vision for African development. So over the years, I've gained a lot of experience. And the book, Know the Beginning Well, it comes from the African proverb. And the proverb says, if you know the beginning well, the end shall not trouble you.
Right.
Which means we need to know from the past, to know about today, and important to plan for the future. So it's that context, and I'll come straight to the COVID issue. If you look at African development, we've made quite a lot of progress, especially over the last 2 decades. And we had a situation where African countries have been growing now, the last decade or so. Some of the fastest growing countries have been in Africa. Poverty has declined quite significantly. We still have a lot of people in extreme poverty. Per capita incomes have been increasing. Suddenly comes COVID. And the impact on the continent. And the IMF just came up with a report which shows that per capita incomes in Africa in 2020 may decline to the levels 10 years ago. That almost 20 people will be in poverty. So what does it mean? So what lessons for the future? It's very important that governments deal with the immediate crisis, but also put policies in place that will allow growth resume to rebound so that the gains we've made are not wiped out.
Is it a bit disheartening from an African perspective that all of the hard work has been set back? And how do you reshape a post-COVID development agenda?
Well, I think it's, it's disturbing, it's disheartening, but we cannot allow that to drive the agenda. We need to be forward-looking. It will require real leadership, and I'll come to that, to bring, and write policies. So we at ASSET, the African Center for Economic Transformation, have come up with 10 policy recommendations that I think are critically important that African countries need to. And these are basically resource mobilization and management is going to be key in terms of domestic resource management. Governance, effectiveness, and transparency in the way we use resources. environment for business and investment, and digital innovations and entrepreneurship. These are the 4 broad areas, and we have come up with detailed recommendations that we are using in our dialogue with African governments and African development partners. And we believe if we all work together around these and African leaders and governments take the lead, we'll be able to get back on the transformation trajectory.
Are you looking for substantial international support in implementing this very forward-looking agenda?
Yes, but I think the immediate crisis has to be dealt with. So much of the focus right now is on the economic impact and the health impact, the health systems. So that's what the focus is on now. Obviously, there's a major call for suspension of debt payments, especially over the next 6 months or so. The whole question of the fiscal space, the liquidity issues. So right now, the focus is on that and getting the health systems right. But at the same time, we also need to think forward. And in that context, I think we will need the support of the international commitment. But like we once said, there's a lot that we in Africa have to do for ourselves. And our focus is to engage our policymakers on some of these key policy issues.
One of the things that we saw in India was out of the blue, literally, cities like Delhi, which are extremely polluted, saw brilliant blue skies. And we saw pollution levels dip to unprecedented levels. Mountain ranges that hadn't been seen for decades suddenly became visible as a result of the lockdown. And so people started saying, are we going to go back to business as usual, or are we going to try and learn the lessons of the grievous damage that we've been doing to the planet and to the environment, and use this as a point to reflect and perhaps to look at smarter ways of re-engineering our growth? Are you also seeing some of those conversations where you are in Ghana or in Washington?
Well, I think that's critical because indeed, the whole issue of climate change and issues like renewable energy, and even before the crisis, we at the African Center for Economic Transformation, we come with our major report this year. Every 3 years, we come up with a major report on Africa's economic transformation. And the report that we started working on about 6 months ago before the crisis was about securing Africa's future. And we identified 4 areas that are going to be critical. And the issue of climate change is important. So when the COVID crisis hit, and in the Washington, there are very few cars in the street. You can also see the bright skies now. The impact of climate on the environment, on development, and how development strategies have to take climate into account. So clearly, it cannot be business as usual. Issues of renewable energy, climate smart agriculture. So these are some of the policy changes that I think are going to be important. And the COVID era has made it even more imperative that we do so.
One of the issues that you've spent a lot of time on is the broad area of multilateral and international development cooperation. Obviously, during your years in the World Bank, there were lessons learned, what works, what doesn't work, the Bretton Woods model and its prescriptions, how relevant they are for countries and so on. Is that something that you have looked at again in the light of your experience in different countries? What broadly works?
Yeah, a lot. In fact, a lot of my book, Know the Beginning Where, is on that topic. Because when I look back in terms of development cooperation, African progress over 40 years, there are some clear lessons. And partnership matters a lot. If you look at where Africa has made progress, it's where we've managed to bring the development partners together around some key issues, but Africa leads. And some of the major initiatives, for example, let's take the HIV crisis. I'll give you an example. I was at the Economic Commission for Africa then. when around 2001, we had to bring African leaders together to refocus on these issues. And Kofi Annan was then the head of UN Secretary General. All the major UN agencies were there, and out of that came the Global Fund that was created.
Right.
It's a major international cooperation, and if you also look at some of the African initiatives like the new Partnership for African Development, the African Peer Review Mechanism, some of the major initiatives, you saw that collaboration, but the importance of African ownership, African leadership, African driving the agenda, and bringing other parties around became important. Briefly also on that issue, policies matter. Having the right policies is critical. Institutional strengthening is important, and building African capacity also becomes critical to this idea. And then if you bring the development partners around, then you can make progress. So some of those are lessons I've learned throughout the years, that development cooperation is important, but has to be driven in such a way that African ownership, African leadership around a shared agenda, and that conditions are not imposed, and it's not so much external driven.
Which kind of brings me to the final part of our discussion, which is to bring the conversation between India and Africa.
Yeah.
In India, at least, we think that, even at a time when we were desperately poor, way back in 1964, there was this great earnest commitment to South-South cooperation and to sharing whatever we could. So we started our Indian technical and economic cooperation back in 1964 and have progressively built upon it to a point where we now offer thousands of training programs in India. We offer some 10,000 scholarships. We are changing with the times, and we are now offering extensive online training programs. And of course, we are doing almost $5 billion plus in terms of lines of credit into Africa. In your wonderful country, Ghana, I often like to think that the Ghana India Kofi Annan Center for Excellence in IT is one of those interesting success stories of what we can do when we tap into the complementarities. But even with that, there is a sense that we can do better. We want to say that our programs are tailored to African requirements. They are demand-driven. They are not top-down. But that's what we think. What do our friends in Africa think? What do you think, sitting in Accra, for example, or somebody sitting in Addis or in Dar es Salaam or in Lusaka about the kind of development cooperation? And I mentioned this because I remember in my early visits into Addis and into other places, they'd say half the cabinet at some point had been taught by Indian teachers or had studied in India at some point, and so on. Times have changed. What is your view on this?
I grew up in the dawn of independence, and I remember the non-aligned movement, the Nehru, Nkrumah, Sukarno. Those were the days. That's what shaped some of us. And Indians' relationship with Africa was strong, has always been strong. There are historical ties, the Indian diaspora. So, and the colonial, so it's important. And you talk about, let's focus on the issue. There's so much in the India-Africa in terms of trade, investments. We can talk about all that. Energy, India relies a lot on conventional energy from Africa. We need to move more into renewable energy. We said that. So all those issues are important. India is the 5th largest investor in Africa, mostly private sector driven. So the India-Africa relationship is strong. But you've touched upon the area which to me is goes to my heart and head: knowledge. Knowledge is critical in development. In fact, there's a report by the World Bank recently, you might have seen that analyzes the World Bank's role in low-income countries, whether it's their money, whether the advisory service, or whether it's knowledge. So knowledge comes. So in that context, I think India's relationship with Africa historical today, and in fact through information technology in particular, and skills training. Because now Africa is a growing population, and we know the very young population, youth population, and all that in the future. So that's a focus area where I think the Indian relationship with Africa is important now. The more we can do to promote knowledge and exchanges for the youth of Africa, I think that would be a fundamental, important way forward. In addition to all the other stuff like trade and investments and all that, but that always comes down to is the knowledge. That's important as Africa seeks to transform its economies.
You know, it's interesting to you say that, because when I was heading the Africa division and I used to travel around quite a lot in Africa and see some of our development projects, my African friends would often draw this interesting contrast between an Indian project and a Chinese project. It could be a railway line in Angola, it could be an oil pipeline in South Sudan, it could be an IT project. But our model was we would bring just 5 or 7 people out of India, and the rest would all be local. Sure. And even in the centers for excellence in IT that we have established, the business model is that in 3 years or 5 years at the most, it should be handed over to the hosts, and they should run it. So we have an extensive train the trainers kind of program. Is there disquiet that you feel that over the years, you know, many of the Chinese projects have essentially been executed by a large number of Chinese coming, and perhaps then some friction emerging?
That's a factor. I think Chinese investments have been huge. It's been driven by state-owned enterprises with low interest loans in return for oil and other natural resources. The fact that a lot of the programs are also driven by, in terms of the construction and all those are facts. And I think as we move forward, that relationship has to be balanced. And I think the African Union and others are working on that. So it's key, but Chinese investment in infrastructure, having said all that, has been of critical importance because infrastructure constraints for development have been very severe. So that also, how do we bring in others to help finance infrastructure development? So India and others, we just had a discussion with the OECD, and we brought together a lot of development partners around something called 21st Century Africa Finance, and the Chinese participated. I want to drive the model to more quality infrastructure development in Africa.
More quality infrastructure with affordable levels of debt, I guess, or sustainable levels of
for sure.
Because when you hear some of the stories coming out of Zambia and elsewhere about the levels of indebtedness, there is a degree of concern over that. But Dr. Amoako, any last word of advice for us for the Indian model of development cooperation? Knowledge.
Yeah, my advice is this. India is one big country. You know, when we talk about cooperation with Africa, whether it's China, Africa, whether it's India, Africa, we need to understand one thing. Africa is a collection of 54 countries. It's not one country. If Africa were one country, it would be terrific. So relationship have to be on 2 levels. It has to be framed in the strategic Pan-African agenda, working in India, and also country-specific.
Absolutely.
And I think the Indian model of partnership over the years, not driven by too much geopolitics, but it's been great. Let's build upon that. A lot of the Indians' investments in Africa are driven by the private sector, and that's important. So let's take what works and make it and deepen it. That would be my advice. I think that we have a lot going for us, so let's emphasize that. But one last point, I think, you know, Africa is moving towards the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement.
Right.
And it's going to be very important that we get the support to make that work. Intra-Africa trade is going to be important. Building transport corridors is going to be important. And we can be and if we project to the future in terms of consumer demand and all that for goods and services, Africa is going to be one of the largest markets in the world. So for India, this relationship and the opportunities are large. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amoako, for those wise words, and such a pleasure to meet you virtually, and I look forward to meeting you in person and taking forward these CNED Development Dialogues, which bring India and our friends in Africa and in South Asia and elsewhere together. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Yes, it's my pleasure. Look forward to see you sometime. Take care.
Thank you.